Why on earth are you investing in real estate through LH? Why set up a corporation, whether to set it up or not? Some say that having insurance is enough, so why bother setting up a corporation? On the other hand, there's also the opinion that you should set up one corporation per real estate property. So what is the correct answer? Let me briefly explain the first point. In the United States, you've probably heard this a lot when investing in real estate. You've heard that you should set up an investment corporation and have the corporation own rental properties. On the other hand, some people say there's no need for that at all. It doesn't matter if an individual owns it, as long as you have good insurance. Some say that insisting on setting up a corporation is just something people who haven't invested or lawyers and accountants say to make money for themselves. On the opposite extreme, there are opinions that say you should create one LH limited liability company for each real estate property to be safe. With such a variety of opinions, it's no wonder people get confused. I want to explore why these discussions are happening and whether they are truly worthwhile. So today, the first topic is whether establishing a corporation is better for real estate investment than investing directly as an individual. Secondly, for those investing in South Korea, what should they consider? In other words, we'll discuss whether a corporation is beneficial in this case, and if so, which type of corporation would be best. Thirdly, when we talk about corporations, we'll discuss whether an LLC or a corporation is more advantageous for real estate investment, especially for those investing in South Korea. Before we dive in, this channel provides professional information on US law, tax law, and financial planning in an easy-to-understand manner. Not just this video, we will continue to upload more beneficial content in the future. So please make sure not to miss out. And if you haven't already, we kindly ask you to hit the subscribe button and the like button right now. Let's get started then. Shall we say, the reasons for establishing a corporation? Let's take a look at that. The first is legal protection. It's an obvious point. By utilizing a corporation, you can separate personal and corporate responsibilities, thus limiting liability. For example, my potential risk is limited to the amount I invested or the amount I invested in that corporation. So there is an advantage in that the risk from these investment activities is not transferred to my other personal assets. This is clearly an advantage. So, in this case, it's rental real estate. Even if an unexpected accident occurs or a lawsuit is filed, my risk is protected up to the amount invested in the corporation. Of course, there are people who say things like this, but don't you take out insurance for each rental property? That's right, you take out insurance, and generally, if the coverage is ample, it might be resolved without needing a corporation. But on the other hand, it might not be. There's no rule saying the coverage will always be sufficient. So, in such situations, having an additional safety net to protect personal assets shouldn't be overlooked. Of course, this would be an advantage we can gain. The second point is about handling expenses. It's like this. Through a corporation, when you run a rental business, it's said to be more advantageous in declaring related expenses. But to be strictly accurate, this isn't entirely true. Why? Ultimately, whether you can process a certain expenditure or cost as an expense is not about whether the corporation or the individual made the expenditure. What's more important is whether you can convince that it was a necessary business expense that had to be incurred to generate actual profit, rather than the entity making the expenditure being a corporation. Of course, despite that, if you operate a business in the form of a corporation, in situations where you are audited by the IRS or state government, it is indeed more likely that operating through a corporation will be recognized as a legitimate business. This is something that comes up when I represent clients during such audits. So, regardless of whether it is theoretically or legally feasible, it might be more advantageous to just operate through a corporation. Ultimately, when an individual invests on their own, it might be considered a hobby or something similar, whereas operating through a corporation shows a serious commitment to business activities. The second reason is that it is more advantageous to appeal to the tax authorities that this is a business generating profit. The third reason, it would naturally be the convenience in management, corporate account. Whether it's rent, you can create one business account. If you do deposits, it will be convenient for accounting and taxation. Since income and expenses are split, the future issues will be reduced. And the fourth point, this is actually a practical reason. The cost of establishment. The annual management costs are not very high. These are the costs incurred to fully enjoy the three advantages mentioned earlier. Although it varies by state, the costs for establishing a corporation and the annual reporting fees. Considering the overall scale, utility, it's not expensive. This is a practical reason why one might not insist on not doing it. So, in conclusion, establish it. There's no need to go into it and argue that you don't have to do it, or that it can be resolved this way, or that insurance will cover it. There are situations where insurance doesn't cover it. So instead of nitpicking these things, I think it's better to just establish it from a practical and realistic perspective. However, setting up a separate entity for each individual real estate property and owning it through a separate corporation, I think that's overdoing it. So not multiple ones. And another common question is whether you need to establish one in each state if you have properties in multiple states. That's not necessary either. If you can manage your investment assets through a single corporation, I think it's definitely worth considering. Now, the next question was about what it's like for a Korean to invest in US real estate. First of all, the reasons or advantages for establishing a corporation that I mentioned earlier still hold true. Therefore, it would be better to invest through the establishment of a corporation. Then, the next question might be what type of corporation a Korean would choose when investing. In the US, the corporate structures commonly used for such investment activities are generally LLCs and corporations. Corporations can actually refer to C corporations and S corporations. However, first of all, corporations are not an option because, as I mentioned, there are types like LLCs, C corporations, and S corporations, but S corporations have certain conditions. To be a shareholder of an S corp, you must be a US citizen, a permanent resident, or a tax resident. So, typical Korean investor investing from Korea would not qualify. Ultimately, the choice comes down to either an LLC or a C-Corp. So, to give you the answer right away on this matter, if it's a personal investment or a family investment with a few investors, an LLC would be more appropriate. For large-scale investments and joint investments among multiple investors, considering a C-Corp would be better. Let's look at the reasons. First, let's talk about the advantages of an LLC. It is said that you can avoid double taxation. This is called a pass-through entity. So it would be rental income earned at the corporate level. Without paying separate corporate taxes, you can pass through that income to individuals and only pay taxes once. In contrast, with a C-Corp, you pay corporate income tax once at the corporate level. And then when you distribute dividends, the individual pays taxes again. So you're paying taxes twice. Therefore, LLC is advantageous in avoiding the burden of double taxation. But even with a C-Corp, in reality, it might not be double taxation. Why? Because you pay corporate tax on the profits generated at the company level. And you can retain and reinvest these profits internally without distributing them to shareholders. So, in fact, essentially, you can continue to generate profits after paying corporate tax once. Of course, in this case, when dividends are eventually distributed or during liquidation, shareholders might still face the risk of double taxation as personal income tax. However, even in this scenario, although this is a bit technical, if you recover your investment by selling the shares of the corporation that owns the real estate, rather than the corporation selling the real estate itself. In fact, in this case, we can avoid the burden of double taxation. Ultimately, this means that whether it's owned by an individual or by an LLC, while a C corporation is said to have double taxation, considering such transactions, it is actually possible to pay taxes only once. So, to summarize, an LLC is better as a way to avoid double taxation. However, in the case of a C corporation, depending on how it is utilized, it is also possible to avoid double taxation. Now, the second point, LLC, is somewhat simpler to operate. There was this kind of talk, right? Earlier, when asked why to incorporate, we talked about legal protection. However, what we need to know is that for a corporation to be recognized as a legal entity and to prevent the risks within the corporation from being transferred to individual shareholders, the corporation must be fully managed and maintained as a corporation. This is referred to in technical terms as maintaining corporate formality. For example, if I don't maintain this properly and mix it freely with personal assets, then the corporation's legal entity status will not be recognized. This is also called piercing the corporate veil, meaning to pierce through the shell. So it means you won't be able to enjoy the benefits of legal protection as a corporation. Therefore, we ultimately need to maintain formality for this entity, which is an LLC. Such annual compliance and the various paperwork procedures we must adhere to in order to maintain the corporate entity are simpler and easier than those for a corporation, which is why an LLC can be considered lighter. However, there is one more thing to consider. It's related to taxes. As mentioned earlier, since an LLC is a pass-through entity. It only bears the tax burden once, unlike a corporation which pays corporate tax and then dividend tax. Isn't it more advantageous than a corporation? But there's one more thing you need to know. The corporate tax rate, it's lower than the individual tax rate. We're only comparing the federal rates in the US right now, but the federal corporate tax rate is 21%. This could be lowered further under the Trump administration, but for individuals, the highest federal rate is 37%. So, for income that is taxed once, a corporation pays 21%, while an individual pays 37%. So, if the real estate investment returns are quite substantial, one might consider setting up a C corporation, retaining the profits, and settling taxes at the 21% rate before reinvesting. Nevertheless, there's also the matter of retained earnings, which is what we call the corporation's reserve funds. If you keep this too high continuously, there will be additional taxes, so this aspect also needs to be considered. In conclusion, you can't really simplify this, but if you had to, you might say that because of double taxation, corporations seem less advantageous. However, since the corporate tax rate is low, if used wisely, there could be more tax-saving opportunities. And if you consider one more thing, as mentioned earlier, a single investor, or a small group coming together, which would be a family investment. If you're investing in real estate, that becomes a long-term holding, and rental investment, ultimately operating it as an LLC, is more desirable because it's easier to manage and allows for single taxation through pass-through taxation, as mentioned earlier. On the other hand, if you're pooling funds from multiple investors to operate on a large scale, in the case of an LLC, each member must file taxes annually. In contrast, with a C-Corp, only the company independently bears the tax burden and files taxes. And unless dividends are issued, shareholders have no reporting obligations, which might be seen as more convenient. The point is that in cases involving multiple people, a C-Corp might be more convenient. For now. So what's the conclusion? Establishing a corporation for real estate investment is beneficial. It's not a bad thing. It's not necessary to go overboard and establish multiple entities, but the utility isn't so low or the burden so high that you shouldn't do it. So, investing in real estate through the establishment of a corporation is preferable. And if that's the case, what kind of entity should you choose? An LLC is suitable for small investors and individual investors who intend to hold real estate for rental purposes over a long period. Additionally, it has the advantage of avoiding double taxation and easier legal management. On the other hand, choosing a C corporation can be strategic for reinvesting retained earnings because the corporate tax rate is lower than the individual tax rate, bearing a lower level of tax burden. And I mentioned that it can be more convenient for multiple investors to manage large-scale real estate investments since only one company needs to file taxes annually. Ultimately, while this might seem like a cyclical discussion, it's about making a comprehensive decision based on factors like investment purpose, whether it's short-term or long-term, the scale of the investment, whether it's individual or multiple investors, tax rates, and the presence or absence of future liquidation dividends. Nevertheless, for small-scale investments, an LLC might be suitable, while for large-scale investments with multiple people, generally, a C corporation would be appropriate. And this applies equally to Korean investors investing in real estate in Korea. I hope today's content was helpful as well. I believe there are many people around you who need this kind of information. This channel is one that grows together with you. Please subscribe and like so you don't miss out on essential information next time. Also, I ask for your help in ensuring that this information continues to be shared with those around you. Thank you.